feel you're inflicting upon yourself. So the forced standing, after 18 to 24 hours of continuous standing, there's an accumulation of fluid in the tissues of the legs, ankles, and feet of the prisoner swell to twice their normal circumference. Skin becomes tense and intensely painful. Large blisters develop, on and on. Heart rate increases, fainting may occur, and eventually renal shutdown, urine production ceases. Ultimately, they develop a delirious state characterized by disorientation, fear, delusions, and visual hallucinations. When we talk about the isolation and sensory deprivation, it leads to a deterioration of thinking and behavior that leads to a state of malleability and a desire to talk, with the added advantage that you can delude yourself into thinking you're doing nothing. Then the other techniques, environmental manipulation, the whole point is when you're talking about de-patterning, you're breaking down anything that the detainee can cling to in terms of how they're going to organize their personality, how they're going to organize their world. And so manipulating light so that you don't know what time of day it is, or having constant light or constant dark, waking at odd hours and inconsistent intervals, the loud music, which is the psychic driving, returning prisoners to new cells following every interrogation session, and then acting as if it's the exact same cell. Controlling their elimination schedules. The hooding, which you see quite a bit of, which they always say is for their own protection. I don't know. So that they don't know where we're taking them. You know, I'm sure that they could, I don't know. Anyway, blathering. It deprives the prisoner of sensory input and has the added effect of dehumanizing the prisoner and thereby facilitating torture. If you look at some of the footage from Zimbardo's study in Stanford, like they don't, when we learn about it in the textbooks, they don't stick in the pictures where the prisoners are being stripped down and wearing paper bags over their heads. Probably in part because they want to put any nudity in our textbooks, but that was part of it. And these are the same techniques that we're using here. I'm gesturing to the screen. And sleep deprivation, obviously, highest functions are going to suffer first. Your capacity to cope with complex changing situations, deterioration in behavior, emotional ability, defects in memory, all increasing with passage of time. So when you look at the poster, for example, like the iconic image of the person standing on the box, they've got electrodes coming off of their hands, they're wearing this hood. It's not always clear what that is about, but you've got hooding, which is for the sensory deprivation. It also helps to humanize. You've got the forced standing, they're standing on a box. And the electrodes running off of the hands is such that no one is touching you, but if your arms drop, you get electrocuted. So anything that you do at that point, you feel, I'm the one who's standing here. All this, and no one's doing this to me. I can't see anything. I've got breakdown here, and then I can't drop my arms. And so all the pain that's being generated seems to be caused from within. And at the point that I pull your hood off to talk to you, you're going to love me because I didn't do anything to you, and now I'm letting you see things. I'm going to talk to you. You're thirsty for any kind of contact, and whoever you're going to get is going to be your best friend. And that's what they're counting on. And this is our legacy. So, I don't know. So in terms of things that we can do, Dr. John Neesty mentioned the withhold APA dues, which in fact there are the petitions copies are out here with everyone that is signed. And I put a lot of stuff on Angel this last week, in addition to what was already there. A lot of the articles and things that we're talking about are on there. Which I mentioned because the most important thing that you can do is to try and break out of the encapsulation of grad school, where you're already being bombarded with plenty of things that you're meant to be reading and doing, and actually bringing some of this information in and researching it and taking a look at it, incorporating it into ethics courses, which, as I understand it, unfortunately, PsyDs don't get till the final year or the final 2 years or something. But those of you that are in the master's programs, I think you get it in your first year. So when you're writing papers, write about this. When you're having arguments in class or with your peers, you're having debates, and peers, I mean students and professors, challenge them on this issue. Talk about it. Make this the central point that you want to discuss, because it is controversial and it'll actually help you flush out a lot of things. We're talking about the ethics code and you're defining who you're going to be as a practitioner. But making a point that there's a lot of pressure to simply talk about sports, to talk about what Britney Spears is doing with her kids. Don't just watch news like that, and don't just read that section in the paper. I highly recommend watching Democracy Now!, which you can watch online. It also is broadcast, I think, on the Wizard here in the city. And there's links to that on Angel as well, because they covered the convention, the mini convention.
Yep.
There's a lot of footage up on. There's links to it from Angel, Amy Goodman covering the mini convention, and in fact, it even has her being told that she's going to be kicked out and security is going to be called. And if you want You can watch Dr. Benke talking about the resolution. He's on there as well. But I highly recommend that. If nothing else, they do a lot of coverage of this particular issue. Like almost every week, there's at least one broadcast that's talking about psychologists and torture. The other thing is maintaining some kind of political or social affiliation that's going to keep you in the loop, so that you're not just having discussions about things that are going on in your class, or who's obnoxious, or did you hear what she said today, or something. You know, it's very easy. I went here to do nothing but talk about what's going on in classes and how obnoxious certain professors are, or something. But taking this global issue and turning it into something that is local, making it global, taking a look at the connections that are here. When they're talking on the news, I put Jose Padilla, when they're talking about how he was broken down. Jose Padilla lived in my neighborhood in Chicago. He lived in Logan Square. He's not someone that I can easily otherize when you put that in that context. When we mentioned earlier about Lieutenant Burge, back in the 80s in the Chicago precinct, I think it's Area 1, Area 2? Sorry, Area 2. They tortured, and when I say tortured, I mean Lieutenant Burge was in Vietnam. He used electrocution on well, they were suspected criminals in Area 2. Most often with people that they suspected of doing violence to police to try and get confessions. And he didn't just use electrocution, like, he also used stress positions, because he would handcuff them above a radiator in a position such that if they have the strength, they can keep their body off of it, but as they weaken, they're going to burn. And also just broadening the notion of what you're seeing as torture and helping challenge the idea that the psychological torture, that these techniques are not as harmful as the physical. In many ways, they're much more harmful, much more long-lasting. And seeing what they're being used for. They are not necessarily tools of interrogation. They are not necessarily to gain information. They are in many ways simply to break down leaders, to break the will of people, to break the will of people. And in many ways, there are aspects of not simply, America doesn't want to just spread democracy, arguably, I will say. They count on us to assume that democracy and the free market and capitalism are all necessarily the exact same thing. And so when they're talking about spreading democracy in Iraq, they're talking about spreading a free market. They're talking about individualism. So it is by no mistake, it is by no coincidence that when these techniques were brought to Iraq, there was a lot incorporated into them that insulted Islam. Flushing the Koran down the toilet, dressing up the prisoners in the Israeli flag, decorating spreading what was purported to be menstrual blood on their faces, using female interrogators, using the dogs, using sexual positions, homosexuality. These things were not added in because the interrogators were simply sadistic, which is what we're always told. They're calibrated. And then we can't be the ones calibrating these.